Everybody, my name is Kenny Tian. It's my pleasure to give a presentation slash training for the new RPA form, Residential Purchase Agreement, published December 2018. The first page is just a standard disclosure, agency disclosure, so everybody is familiar with this form. No changes have been made to this form. And then the second form is the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent. That's also a standard form. No changes have been made to this form as well. And let me just kind of briefly explain the importance of each of these forms. Agency disclosure is required by California law to be given to both the buyer and the seller for just about every real estate transaction in the state of California. That includes vacant land, that includes any sort of residential and or commercial, just about every type of real estate transaction. The sale of real estate transaction requires an agency disclosure. Business transaction does not require an agency disclosure. The next form is possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent. Now, the purpose of this call is actually to cover the real estate agent, because sometimes when we are listing agent, we are contacted by a buyer who wants us to also represent the buyer. So that is a dual agency. So this particular form allows us to represent both the buyer and the seller and obtain written consent at the same time. So by signing this particular form, we allow ourselves to act as dual agent in a given transaction. Also, this particular form allows us to represent more than one buyer who are competing for the same property. So you can legally represent more than one buyer to compete against each other on the same property. And also, this form allows an agent to represent multiple sellers, because sometimes these sellers may have competing interests against each other. For example, you may have sellers that are not speaking to each other, they are not on good terms, such as sellers in a divorce situation. This particular form allows you to represent both the husband and the wife to list their properties. So it's a very useful form because you can represent multiple buyers, multiple sellers, and dual agency. All three situations are covered by this form. Once this form is signed, you are covered. Next form is a wire fraud and electronic funds transfer advisory. This form has been in the package for quite some time now. The purpose of the wire fraud and electronic funds transfer advisory is to educate the consumers the risk of wire transfer over the internet. There are risks that the money that was sent by wire might not reach the right destination. That's why it is important for the buyer to contact the escrow to make sure that the account number and the routing information that has been provided to the buyer through the wiring instruction is the correct one and not a fake one. Sometimes, if you have never seen a fake one, it's quite interesting because they look very real, okay? They are not fake at all, but they look very real. So be very, very careful. Before you have your buyer wired a large fund to the escrow, make sure that they call up the escrow. Now, don't get the phone number from the email get the phone number independently, because if it's a fake number, you might reach the wrong destination and inadvertently get the okay to send the money. Okay. So this particular form protects the agents against liability because it gives the buyer advisory on things that they have to do to protect themselves. And now we have the RPA itself. If you look at the bottom of the page, you will see that it was revised December 2018. So it is very, very recent. So whatever that you're learning today is the most up to date. Okay? All right. Let's start from the top. Over on the first page, you will fill out the date you prepare the form. Usually, if you expect the form to be signed the next day, put the next day's date. Don't put today's date, because you want to be as accurate as possible. And then on the first line, 1A, you will put down the buyer's name. Sometimes there are multiple buyers. For example, if you have 2, 3, or 4 buyers, you got spaces for you to enter the different buyers' names. And then 1B is for you to input the property address. You can input the street address, city, state, and zip code. And then 1C is where you will input the purchase price. As you know, all you need to do is to type in the purchase price in number, and then you get your description in words. Close of escrow. You can designate a specified date to close the escrow, or you can put down the days of escrow. Actually, it's actually days after acceptance, because usually from acceptance to actual opening of escrow, there might be a few days. So, for example, if you enter into a contract on a Monday, sometimes it might be Tuesday or Wednesday before the escrow is open. So there is a couple of days of difference. For this example, I'm just going to use 30 days escrow. Okay? Let's say it's 30 days. Now, there's one change here, which is the agency. They made some improvement to the form. If you look at 2B, you can input the seller's brokerage firm's name. And this time, the form itself has the firm's name right here. For example, if it's Centermac is the buyer's, the seller's agent, you will input Centermac's name here and input Centermac's license number. And if we represent both the buyer and the seller, you will check this box. But if we represent the seller only, you will check the other box. In the example that I'm giving you, we represent both the buyer and the seller. And then here is where you, as an agent, would input your individual name here. I'll just use Liu Zhang as an example. Okay, and then Leo will put whatever his license number here. Buyer's brokerage firm, since we represent both sides, is also Centermac Realty Inc. If we don't represent both sides, then it's the other brokerage name. And then you put, let's say, for example, Ted Chen represents the buyer, right? So One person represents the seller, the other person represents the buyer. Yeah, this is the first change to the new form. Now it's very clear. Paragraph 3, I don't see any change. But for the benefit of the new agents, the deposit is usually 3% of the purchase price. So if the purchase price is $1 million, 3% of that is $30,000. So I'm just going to put in $30,000, right? These days, we don't use checks anymore. It is almost always deposited by electronic fund transfer. So we'll just use the default. And by contract, the deposit would have to be made within 3 business days after acceptance. You can specify a different time frame, but 3 business days is like the standard practice. A business day does not include holidays, and it does not include Saturdays and Sundays. I haven't seen, or nor do I have the need to deposit money into escrow by personal checks or cashier checks. I don't think I have done it in that fashion for at least 5 years ago. Okay, so you know, we don't do that anymore. Okay. Increased deposit is kind of rare. We don't normally do increased deposit in a residential transaction, but commercial is quite common. For example, commercial, you might put down an initial deposit, and then after a certain period of time, usually after, let's say, the due diligence period has expired, the seller may require the buyer to put in additional deposit. But it doesn't happen much in residential. Additional deposit is also called an increased deposit. If your buyer is making an all-cash offer, check right here. For purposes of illustration, I'm just going to assume that this buyer needs to get a loan, and the buyer is borrowing $600,000. Usually, it is conventional financing. If it's something other than conventional, for example, if it's FHA, you will check FHA. If it's VA, you will check VA. Some situation, it could be seller financing or assumed financing. Seller financing is basically where the seller will provide the loan to the borrower, to the buyer, to make the purchase. That's called seller financing. Assumed financing has to do with certain type of loans that are assumable, such as an FHA loan that is assumable. That's assumed financing. You don't normally come across that. And I don't always fill out the blank here, but some seller may require you to fill out the information. For example, it says the loan shall be at a fixed rate not to exceed a certain percentage. The purpose of that is to protect the buyer. For example, if the buyer maximum qualifying interest rate is 5.5%, the buyer will just put 5.5% here. Okay? That is if the buyer is getting a fixed rate. But if the buyer is getting an adjustable rate loan, the buyer can say, well, the initial rate is 3.25%, for example. These days, probably you don't have 2.35 anymore. Maybe through 3.75, okay, for adjustable loan. And if the buyer is getting like a second loan, for example, it's called the piggyback loan. What that means is the buyer does not have a lot of money for down payment. So in order to qualify for a loan, the buyer needs two loans, first loan and second loan. And the first loan is usually the one that is at a lower interest rate. And then the second loan is what we call the piggyback. The piggyback is just a second loan. It's in the second position, and it's usually a smaller amount, but for a higher interest rate. Okay? Yeah?
What's the name of the loan called?
Piggyback, P-I-G-G-Y. Okay, so one loan is piggybacking on the other loan. Okay? I'm just going to assume there is no second for this one. For this example that I'm using, it's just 600,000. Okay? And we're doing an adjustable loan. Okay? And then the D3 is talking about FHA/VA loan, because FHA/VA loan has certain requirements. That requirement is within a certain number of days after acceptance, the seller the buyer had to deliver to the seller a written notice of any lender required repairs or costs that the buyer requests the buyer to pay for or otherwise correct. You know, in some type of loans like FHA or VA, they have very strict repair requirements, and usually the program requires the seller to make the repairs. And because of that, the seller wants to know early in the transaction what repairs they are required to make in order to help the borrower get the loan approved. So the default is 17 days. You can put in a different number. However, it also says your seller has no obligation to pay or satisfy lender requirement unless agreed in writing. What that means is, generally speaking, the seller has no obligation to make repairs to the property in order to assist the borrower to get the loan approved. However, some seller may want to do that just because it is a difficult property to sell. You know, they want to help the borrower to get the loan, so they're willing to put it in contract to make certain repairs for the property so that the borrower can get their loan approved. And then there is another form. This is called the FHA-VA mandatory clause. Whenever, yes?
You said seller doesn't have to be help the buyer to fix the property so that he can finance it through FHA or VA loan.
Yeah, there's requirement. That's right.
Cases,
Yeah, if it, most of the time the seller would agree to it because the seller wants to close the deal. There's another form called it's just a standard form. You gotta do is to pull out the form, have the buyer, the seller, buyer sign it, That's part of the agreement. If you have every standard form attribute. Okay. There's closing cost. Okay. That. All right. You guys still there? Yeah, you guys still there. That's good. Thank you. And the recorder still works. But my screen is gone, so let me go back to my zip form. Okay, we're just talking about the appraisal contingency. You're not required to have one, but if you need one, that's where you would indicate your appraisal contingency. And it's still 7 days there, that 17 days, so that did not change. If you don't need an appraisal contingency, just check this box. And loan applications, that's still the same as the old one. There's no change. So the buyer is supposed to submit a letter to the seller from the lender that indicate that the lender is reviewing the buyer's written application and credit report. Okay, that is a right that the seller has. Most of the time in our transaction, the buyer is seldom requested to provide that, but it is a right that belongs to the seller. Loan contingency. If it's not an all-cash offer, then there is a loan contingency. It says here the buyer shall act diligently and in good faith to obtain the designated loans. Buyer's qualification for the loan specified above is a contingency of disagreement unless otherwise agreed in writing. So there is automatically a loan contingency if it's not an all-cash purchase. And then there's a 21 days period of time for the buyer to remove the loan contingency. So that has not changed. If it's an all-cash offer, you don't have to check number 4, because all-cash offer, by definition, there's no loan contingency. Okay? However, even if a borrower has a loan, sometimes the borrower wants to make his offer more attractive than the competition. So a borrower may be willing to indicate no loan contingency even if the borrower has a loan. So it's not always that when the borrower has a loan, the borrower must have a loan contingency. It's always a good thing for the borrower to have a loan contingency when they have a loan to protect the borrower. But sometimes in a very, very hot market, the borrower may be willing to give up the loan contingency. Okay, but as a real estate agent, we don't normally ask the borrower to waive the loan contingency unless there is a reason to. Lenders limit on buyer's credit. That's a standard provision. We don't need to do anything about that. Buyer stated financing, we leave that alone. And for the sale of buyer's property, now, if you have a buyer who needs to sell his home in order to make this purchase, for example, the buyer doesn't have enough money for down payment, and the buyer has to make sure that if he's not successful in selling his home, that he wants to be able to get out of this contract and not lose his deposit. Now, if that's the case, then you would include in this offer a contingency for the sale of buyer's property. That will be 4B here. The agreement and buyer's ability to obtain financing are contingent upon the sale of property owned by buyer as specified in the attached addendum. If your buyer is in that situation, you want to check B, okay? Now, if your buyer does not need to sell his or her home in order to make this purchase. For example, if you have a tenant who is buying property for the first time as a home buyer, then we don't need to worry about the sale of the buyer's property. We just need to kind of stick to the default. So the only time you will use B is when the buyer is currently having another property, but don't have enough money for down payment. That's the only time you will check B, okay? Otherwise, you use the default. All the other stuff will really depend on the individual situation. Sometimes, you know, as a buyer, you lose out on an offer, but you want to be a backup offer. Now, if you want to be a backup offer, you have to check this backup offer addendum. Backup offer means if the initial buyer is not successful, then you get a chance to buy this property. If the initial offer is successful, then you won't be able to purchase this property. So it's like a backup, okay, to the seller. So if you have a backup offer situation, check this box. Septic well and property monument addendum. For example, if you work on a property where there is a septic tank, you want to check this addendum because a septic tank requires a septic tank addendum. Or if you have an agricultural property where you might have a house on it, and the house depends on the well for wells for their daily use of water, then you will need to include this addendum. Short sale addendum. Now, if you have a short sale situation, for example, if the seller owes the bank more money than what the property is worth. Let's say, for example, the seller owes the bank $600,000 and the property is only worth $500,000. That means that the property is upside down. When the property is upside down, you need to do a short sale. So you need to include a short sale addendum. And then this addendum number here, that is to provide, it's a form that allows you to add additional terms and conditions that are not in the standard form. If you have a special situation, for example, if there are certain situations, unique situations that you can't find in the standard form, you do that by adding an addendum. It's called addendum 1, okay? So you check this box. But if you don't have such situation, you will just leave it blank. Okay. Now on the court confirmation addendum, court confirmation addendum is only used when you have a probate sale, because many probate sales require court confirmation. Not all probate sales require court confirmation. Some probate sales require and some does not. So it depends on the situation. If it requires, check this box and include the court confirmation addendum. And buyer and seller advisories, for example, if it's a probate sale, you always want to check the probate advisory. Sometimes the property is held in the name of a trust. If it is held in the name of a trust, you want to check the trust advisory. Short sale information and advisory. If it's a short sale situation, make sure you include the short sale addendum, the short sale and the short sale advisory form. The buyer's inspection advisory, the form checks the box for you automatically. That is because our association wants us to provide inspection advisory to the buyer. Statewide buyer and seller advisory. It is not a required form by California law, but it is a required form by Centermac Realty. Whenever we represent a buyer or seller, we always want to use the SBSA, the Statewide Buyer and Seller Advisory, to protect ourselves. It gives you more protection as a real estate agent. Okay? It's a free form anyway. Why not use it, right? REO advisory. REO advisory refers to situation where the property is held in the foreclosure department of the bank. They call it the REO department. REO stands for real estate owned. It means real estate properties that are taken back by the lender. In other words, the borrower could not pay the mortgage. The lender foreclosed on the property and nobody bought it at a trustee sale. So the lender winds up with the property and they send it to the REO department. So if you're buying property from the bank as an REO, you want to include the REO advisory. Now, number 6 here, it's actually a pretty handy little space that you can make use of to add certain language without, when you want to add additional terms and conditions to the standard form, you have 2 choices. If it's not too lengthy, usually I just make use of number 6 and add the additional terms here. However, if it's too lengthy, it doesn't fit within number 6, it is better to use addendum 1 as I described earlier. Allocation of costs. In order to figure out who's, okay, now, first of all, hazard zone disclosure report, natural hazard zone disclosure report, that's always paid by the seller, although the buyer can offer to pay for it. But standard practice, we always make the seller pay for it. Usually, we just indicate here, seller's service provider of seller's choice. That way, the seller can decide who the seller wants to place the order with. And it's usually the escrow that do it for the seller. In Northern California, you actually have to communicate with the escrow officer who you're going to use for a natural hazard disclosure, and it is advisable that you make that determination early so that there is no delay in the escrow. Sometimes there could be a delay in the close of escrow if you do not determine who the NHD provider is, if you are the seller's agent. And if there are any other types of reports you want the seller, you can indicate here, okay? Now, sometimes the buyer and the seller can determine who's going to pay for what report. So 2 and 3 gives you the ability. For example, if you have a tank situation, the buyer and the seller can decide who's paying for the report. When you have a septic tank, you need to have the septic tank inspected. Government requirement and retrofit. For me, I usually check the carbon monoxide and smoke alarm because usually the seller's responsibility, so I make the seller take care of that. It says shall pay, so if it's not installed, the seller will purchase the smoke alarm and carbon monoxide and install it. The next item is called the minimum mandatory government inspections and reports. If you buy a property in San Francisco, we have what we call the 3R report. Now, if you buy a piece of property in San Francisco, we don't use the CAR form. We actually use the San Francisco Association form, which is kind of different from the CAR form. Now, if you're using the San Francisco form, I'm sure it's provided in the form that a 3R report is required to close the escrow. But here, we don't know what mandatory government inspections is required for a particular property in a particular city. Sometimes some local cities may have certain inspection requirements. So since we don't know, we always make the seller pay for it. As far as whether to check the next box, many sellers and their listing agents, they don't want to see that. They want to see you leave it blank. So as a buyer's agent preparing the offer, usually I leave this box blank. Escrow and title. In order to figure out who pays for escrow and who's going to pay for title, you need to look at the chart. there is a chart that I saved in our Google Drive, and then Centermac agent, you should have access to this Google Drive. Everybody can have access to that. And there should be a chart in here that tells you who's paying for what cost. And the name of the chart is called Who Pays for What. Something like Who Pays What. That's how I named the chart. It's easier to find. Oh, actually, it's in the agents folder. I believe it's in the agents folder, so I need to go into the agents folder. See that? There is a PDF here. You can open the PDF, and you should be able to see the chart here. Okay? Now, let's say, for example, we're buying a property in Santa Clara. So you go down to Santa Clara. Let's use San Francisco as an example. Now, San Francisco, the buyer actually pays for the escrow and the title. Whereas in Santa Clara, it's the seller that's paying for it. You know what county in which you're buying a property to decide who's paying for what. Okay? All right. Now, let's say, for example, in this example, we're making the seller pay for it. Okay? And then if the seller pay for it, you can say, you can put down First American Title Company if you want. These days, the market is not so hot anymore, so the seller doesn't have the say to everything anymore. So you can decide which title company you want to use or which escrow company you use if you are a buyer. Okay? So, for example, if you want First American, you can just type in First American Title Company for both the escrow and the title services. But if you want to say escrow or seller's choice, you can do that if it's the seller that's paying for it. Okay? Now, if it's the seller that is paying for it, you can say that. But if it's the buyer that's paying for it, that is a different story. If it's a buyer that's paying for it, the buyer actually has the right to choose which escrow services or which title services the buyer wants to use. There may be a law that says that if a buyer that's paying for it, the seller cannot dictate which side who's paying for the city tax. For example, you know, let's look at Santa Clara. If you're buying a piece of property in Mountain View, it will be a split between the buyer and the seller for the city transfer tax. And in Mountain View, the rate is $3.3 per $1,000. So it's very expensive in Mountain View for the city transfer tax. Okay. Now, whereas if you're buying in somewhere like Alameda, it's also buyer-seller split. Okay. And then you got different cities. So it depends on the city. If you look at Piedmont, it's like $13 per 1,000. So it's a lot. Okay. But look at Berkeley, it's like $15 per 1,000. That's even worse. I think it might have gone up. Okay, this chart may not be up to date, so I need to get an up-to-date chart for you guys. Okay. So I will get an up-to-date chart for you guys because that is not up to date. Okay. All right, so it could be 50-50. Now, let's say, for example, it's 50-50. If it's 50-50, you will go down, you will put right here like 50-50, okay? All right. Now, HOA transfer fee. Now, if you're buying a condominium that has an HOA, if the HOA has a transfer fee, usually we make the seller pay for it. The seller, by law, has to pay for all the preparation costs for the HOA documents to be delivered to the buyer. HOA fees for preparing documents. And then, but that's HOA documents. If it's HOA fees for preparing documents other than required by law, then it's subject to negotiation. This one, you can still make the seller pay for it, or you can make the buyer pay for it. Because sometimes the lender may require certain HOA documents that are not required by law. Now, if it's the buyer's lender, sometimes you can make the buyer pay for it because it's not required by law for the HOA to provide such documents. Private transfer fee is very rare. On some properties, there's private transfer fee. Now, if it's private transfer fee, usually I make the seller pay for it. Okay? The rest of it, I'll leave blank for now. And then for the warranty, home warranty, usually I make the seller pay for it. And you can specify it not to exceed amount. It can be $500 for a home, let's say less than $700,000. If it's a more expensive home, like a $2 million home, sometimes it could be as much as $1,000. Okay, so you set a not to exceed amount. And then usually for the home warranty, you can either indicate your own provider, indicate a provider like First American Home Warranty, or you can say service provided or seller's choice. Okay. And if you want air conditioner or a pool coverage, you just go ahead and indicate that. Notice to buyer and seller. This is about items included in and excluded from the sale. Items included in the sale would typically include all the fixtures. But if you want to include things like refrigerator, make sure you check it. If you don't check it, then the refrigerator does not stay. So if I want to include the refrigerator, I check it here. And I want to include the stoves, I check it here. It's very important you check the stove because there's oftentimes you get dispute because somebody forgot to check stove. And then when it's about time for the seller to move, seller say, well, you didn't ask for the stove to stay because the buyer's agent forgot to check the box for stoves. Okay, if you want the stoves to stay, please check the box for stove. Washer and dryer, same thing. If you want the washer and dryer to stay, make sure you check it. Okay, or else the seller can remove the washer and dryer. Right? Okay, got that. And then you need to talk about solar system. If there is a solar system installed on the roof, you need to find out, is there a lease? If there is a lease, how is the buyer going to assume the lease, or does the buyer want to assume the lease? Most of the time, the seller is going to require the buyer to assume the lease because the seller does not want to be liable to the solar company. So you need to discuss with the buyer if the buyer wants to assume the lease. And if the buyer does not want to assume the lease, then it presents a problem. Anything that is excluded from the sale has to be specified here. Anything that you can think of, is rarely that I complete anything here. Usually everything is included, all fixtures are included. It's only the personal property that I need to worry about. And as far as specifying whether or not the buyer is going to occupy the property as the buyer's residence, be careful how you check this box. Because if you check the wrong box, or if you indicate that the buyer is occupying the property as the buyer's primary residence, and the buyer is getting a hard money loan, it could be a problem. Because hard money lenders cannot loan to a buyer who is buying the property as a primary residence. A buyer can't get a hard money loan for primary residence. Now, on the other hand, if the buyer is getting a loan that requires the buyer to use it as a primary residence in order to get the lowest rate, then it has to be specified as a buyer's occupying the property as a primary residence. Seller occupied or vacant property. Usually, we want the seller to give us the keys on the date of close of escrow. But sometimes the seller wants a few extra days. Typically, we give the seller 3 extra days from close of escrow to move their belongings out of the house. And in order to do that, you need to write here, you got 2 choices. The first choice is on the day of close of escrow, and the second choice is 3 calendar days. Usually, I check this box and put down 3 calendar days. Now, if this box is not checked, then the seller have to get everything out by the close of escrow. So that's pretty burdensome for the seller. Usually we use 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock is like the default. Seller remaining in possession after close of escrow. This refers to a situation where there is like lease back or rent back. Because some seller needs time to look for a replacement home. And in order to do that, they negotiate with the buyer to get extra time to stay in the house to allow them to find more time to find their replacement home. So in that situation, you might want to decide how much time you are going to give the seller. If you're giving the seller 29 days or less, you will check the first box, less than 30 days. If the seller is occupying 30 days or more, you check the second box. Why is there a difference? What's the difference between 30 days or between less than 30 days or 30 days or more? The difference is if he does not occupy the property more than 30 days, he's not a tenant. So you want to keep it to about 29 days. If he's not a tenant, he doesn't have all the tenant's rights. But if he is a tenant, he may have tenant rights that you don't want him to have. That's why, if possible, use 29 or less. But if you can't avoid it, then, by all means, use 30 or more days choice. Now, let's say, for example, he needs more than 30 days, so we'll check this box. Okay? Tenant occupied property. If property shall be vacant at least 5 days prior to close of escrow. Now, when you have a tenant occupied property, there are 2 possible outcomes. One is the seller is responsible for getting the tenants out before close of escrow. The other, tenants will stay. Now, if the tenants stay, you want to check this box, which is this box right here, okay, that I just checked. The rest are just a standard provision, so I'm not going to be spending much time talking about it. It has a bunch of disclosure in here just to satisfy California law. Not that important. It is important, but it's not something that you have a choice. Basically, association put it in the offer, so you don't have to worry about it. And we got a lot of standard provision here that I'm going to skip. Now, on the 14, paragraph 14, that is the amount of time that the seller has to provide all the necessary disclosure and reports to the buyer. Typically, it's 7 days after acceptance. As a seller and the listing agent, you want to provide your disclosures and your reports as soon as possible. if you even left out a report or disclosure, you are actually extending the contingency period without you even know it. Say, for example, you give the buyer 17 days contingency for inspection, and you left out one report. And the 17 days does not expire until 5 days after the last report is provided to the buyer. Why do I say that? Well, let's look at 14B1. It says buyer has 17 days after acceptance to complete all buyer's investigations, review all disclosures, reports, and so forth. 17 days. But if you look at paragraph A, it says sellers have 5 days to deliver all the disclosures, reports, and information for which the seller is responsible. Under all of these paragraphs, there are many paragraphs contained in the offer that requires the seller to provide reports of disclosure. If the seller even left out one, it says here, if by the time specified, seller has not delivered any such item, buyer, after first delivering to seller a notice to seller to perform, may cancel this agreement. So if the seller does not provide any of the disclosure within 7 days, buyer can cancel the contract by giving the seller a notice to perform. Okay? All right. Now, earlier I did say that if the seller forgot a report or disclosure, even though the contract provides for 17 days contingency period, the buyer actually has more than 17 days. And the reason is the 17 days does not expire until after the buyer has received all the reports and the disclosures from the seller. Not only that, it does not expire until 5 days after the seller has delivered the last report. Let's say 17 days have passed. So suddenly the listing agent call up the buyer's agent and say, well, it's time for you to remove your contingency. And then the buyer's agent say, well, you know, you're supposed to give me the whatever report, okay? Let's say, for example, it's a 3R report, okay, in San Francisco, right? And they forgot to give the 3R report to the buyer. Buyer's going to say, well, I don't have to remove contingency yet because you forgot to give me the 3R report. So in reality, now by the time the listing agent finds out that they forgot to give the listing report and then provide it right away, right? Let's say 17 days have passed. So the buyer is going like, hey, I don't have to remove because you didn't give me the 3R report. And then the listing agent gives the 3R report to the buyer on the 17th day. Buyer has 5 extra days to remove the contingency. Now, what if the buyer is playing game with you? Buyer knows how many reports you forgot to give him, right? And if he wants to buy extra time, all he needs to do is to tell you one report at a time that you forgot to give. Right? And as a listing agent, you have to understand what report you have to give to the buyer. All of it. Or else they're just going to go one at a time, right? Oh, you forgot to give me this. Oh, you forgot to give me this, right? Then they keep extending the contingency period, right? Okay. All right.
In this situation, can the listing still send you the notice?
They can send, I'll just tell them, hey, every time they send me something, right? They send me the 3R report. And then they say, okay, you got 5 extra days, right? All right, 5 days pass. All right, selling agent, time to remove contingency, right? You said, well, I'm not removing. What about this other report you have not given me yet? And then he said, well, you should have told me sooner. Why did you wait until now? You're playing games, right? Of course, it's not nice to play games. I'm just saying that if you're on the other side, you're the listing agent, people could play games on you. If you're not on top of your disclosure and the reports, people can go one report at a time and say, you didn't give me that, you didn't give me that, you didn't give me that, right? So they can actually give you the notice to perform after they have given you all of the reports and you still have not removed your contingencies, okay? This has been around for a long time, but if you are learning it for the first time, good for you.
You have a list of what kind of disclosure?
We have a checklist. I need to update the checklist, but we do have a checklist. Okay. Removal of contingencies with offer. This is nothing new. So oftentimes when we have like a contingency, we ask let's say for example, real estate agent, right? Now when the market is really hot, when it's very competitive, many buyers remove pretty much all of their contingencies with the offer, but we don't have this market anymore. So the chances of us using removal of contingencies with offer is actually slimmer now. Less chance of us having to use it because there's less competition now, probably, right? Okay. All right. Now, seller's right to cancel based on buyer's contingencies, and seller's right to cancel based on contract obligations. Those are two different things. What are the buyer's contract obligations? Well, the buyer's contract obligations would be to sign all the disclosures and reports and give it back to the seller. That's one of the buyer obligations. Another buyer's obligation is to provide proof that the buyer has submitted loan to the lender for review. Even though we normally don't insist with, but that's a right that belongs to the seller. Okay, so buyer's right is based on contingencies, the seller has the right to require the buyer to fulfill certain contract obligations. Signing back disclosure is one of them. Now, let's say, for example, you're the listing agent. You just put a contract into escrow, and then you realize that there's another buyer that submitted a higher offer. You wanted to get rid of this buyer, and one way to get rid of the buyer is to provide a notice to buyer to perform on all the contract obligations. And I already told you, sign all the disclosures and provide a lot of stuff. Okay. All those things are itemized on the notice to buyer to perform form. So you can figure out what you want to use to get rid of this buyer. Okay? But as a selling agent, when you see a request like that, you be careful. Because if you don't perform, you don't give the things that the seller wants, they can cancel and get rid of you. Okay? Notice the buyer to perform, the standard is that we give them 2 days to perform. Okay? 2 days after delivery, and that's 2 calendar days. That means that it includes Saturday, Sunday, and holiday. Now, what if the second day falls on a holiday? Then it goes to the next business day, because all legal obligations are not required. Legal obligations are not required to be performed on holidays. But for purpose of counting the 2 days, it would include the Saturday and Sunday. Say, for example, you serve a notice to perform on Friday. Saturday doesn't count. No, Saturday counts as a day. It doesn't say business day, it says day, right? So if it says day, Saturday counts, right? And Sunday also counts normally, but you're not required to perform on a Sunday. So the first day to perform is a Monday. Okay? Day does not mean business day. Day means calendar day. Okay? Now I want to talk to you about this $1,000 thing. If a buyer has the right to get their deposit back, you have to give it back. If you don't give it back, there could be serious consequences. Okay? Now, minimum is $1,000 penalty. If the deposit money is $10,000, and if you refuse to give the deposit back, and the buyer has the right to get the deposit back, they can sue you. And on top of that, you have to pay their attorney's fees. Okay? And it can be very serious. Have you ever seen attorney's fees? That is like $100,000 for a dispute over $15,000 deposit. You probably haven't heard it. I'm not kidding you. It's a true case. Okay. Final verification of condition. Now, this is one where I want to talk to you about. Normally, before you receive the key to the house, right, you do what they call a final walkthrough, right? Now, when you do a final walkthrough, if there's a problem with the house, it's better that if it's not a major problem, you wait until close of escrow to fix it, because otherwise it might delay close of escrow. But if it's a major problem, you don't want to close it. If you represent the buyer, it's better that you fix it, because after it closes, sometimes it might be difficult to get the seller back to fix the problem for you. Okay? Now, this is where you put a copy of this agreement, including any counteroffer and addendum, shall be delivered to escrow within 3 days after acceptance. That's why, as a listing agent or selling agent, whenever you have an offer accepted, immediately email the offer, the accepted offer, to the escrow, because you only got 3 days to do it.
So what if sometimes the agent does not update it, like a website that says pending more than 3 days? Oftentimes.
That's an ethical issue. That is an ethical issue. Yeah. Okay. Now, this one is very important. Don't forget. Number 21, make sure you don't accidentally leave out the initial. Because you do, somebody might get mad at you in the future, because there are some legal consequences if you don't include the initials. Make sure you include the initial. Now, what happens if you have 4 buyers? Then what do? You put in 4 initials here? Yeah, you put in 4 initials. Now, actually, how do you squeeze in 4 initials? It's hard. So there is another form that you use to make up for the other 2 initials. Okay? It's called the additional signature addendum. All right? You use the additional signature addendum. All right? Don't get lazy. If you need 4 initials, put in 4 initials. Right? Put in 2 here and 2 more in the additional signature addendum. Might be tough. I don't think the system allows you. You have to kind of like, but you don't have to do that. Just use the additional signature addendum. You need to use that form anyway, because that requires you to use that form. Dispute resolution, and same thing. When you have arbitration clause, make sure you get everybody to initial that. If you forgot, somebody might get upset at you in the future. Okay? Didn't look like they make a lot of changes here. A lot of stuff is still the same. Okay? Now, I want to show you the definition of close of escrow. What does close of escrow mean? It means the date the grant deed is recorded. Okay? Close of escrow means the date the grant deed is recorded. Days means calendar days. Do you see that? It doesn't mean business days. It means calendar days. Okay? And usually for the expiration for the offer, I'm just going to use the standard expiration, unless you have a reason to use a different one. The standard expiration is usually 3 days, right? 3rd day after the offer is signed by the buyer. 5 o'clock. That's the standard. And this is where you put, now you see this checkbox right here? For example, if your buyer is a trust or a business, you want to use the representative capacity form, okay, if your buyer is a business or a trust. Or if it's a probate case, then you will need to use a representative capacity signature disclosure form. And this is where you put the buyer's name, okay? And this is where you put your seller's name and signature if the seller accepts the offer. I want to explain a couple of things here because sometimes you guys forgot, you didn't do this right. You see this one right here where it says seller's acceptance is subject to attached counter offer. What that means is if this box is checked, it means that there is no acceptance yet, even if the seller signs on this form, because there is an SMCO that comes with that signed offer. It means that there is no acceptance yet if this box is checked. And you will only get acceptance if the buyer agrees to the attached counter offer. So the seller signing their signature here doesn't mean you have a binding contract if this box is checked. Okay? Now this particular place here, it's also important because this is where actually it's initialed by the agent, not the buyer, because it says confirmation of acceptance. Do not initial in making a counter offer. But if the seller simply just signed a buyer's offer without a counter offer, usually the selling agent will put their initial here, and then they will say when that it says here a copy of signed acceptance was personally received by buyer or buyer's authorized agent. Now, so the buyer submits an offer, and then the seller accepts the offer, and then the buyer's agent will initial here, and then the buyer's agent will indicate when that signed acceptance was received, and you will put down the date here and the time. And the reason why you need to do that, because sometimes when you're in a lawsuit, you need to find out exactly what time acceptance was received. Because if acceptance is not received, there is no binding contract. Got that? If acceptance is not received by the other side, there's no binding contract. That's why the buyer's agent needs to initial here and put down the date and the time that the signed acceptance is received. Okay? And over here is where you fill out the respective brokers and agents information. I'm sure you guys know how to do that, right? Okay, so it doesn't look like they make much changes to the form, just on the first page. So relatively, there are no changes to the form. Okay, so you're pretty much up to date on the new form. Okay, thank you for joining me today. I know it's a little long, okay, because I have to explain this in detail because I don't want to leave anything out. I'm just going to do it once and I will not do it again until there's an update, okay? All right, thank you for joining me.